to 20 minutes, 15 minutes compared to 10 minutes, meat and potatoes respectively. He's less efficient. So when you think about it, Rose needs fewer inputs, and admittedly we're just using time. So time is kind of a surrogate for what we think is value, but also in the sense that we think meat's more valuable than potatoes. We're not putting a dollar figure on it, but we're, as I'd mentioned earlier, quantitatively kind of making that assumption. But also when it comes to inputs. So if Rose needs only 20 minutes, right? Minutes time being an input versus 60 minutes, she's much more efficient, 10 minutes versus 15 minutes. So she has an absolute advantage in both of those commodities, right? Meat and potatoes certainly would be deemed commodities, right? Fewer inputs needed, okay? Now with that said, right, that doesn't mean these two parties shouldn't trade. And as you can see by the exercise that we just went through, both parties can actually come out ahead, right? Now again, we kind of assumed the starting point was at point 1 where the two parties just kind of split their time, and I'll do that with you on the exam just so you'll have a nice starting point. Okay, now the question becomes, and let's move on to opportunity cost, which you already know what that is, what you have to give up to go get something, right? What else could you do with that body of resources, right? And here it's really just a specific amount of time because we're not measuring any other inputs other than really just kind of time. Okay, now with that said, what I want to do, I'm going to have to erase what I have up here. All right, I just want to create a quick table here. It's just kind of our opportunity cost table. And you can certainly use the opportunity cost table, all right, to help you decide, figure out where that sweet spot is. Okay, so let's go with a couple different colors here. Frank and Rose. All right. And what I meat first. Okay, all right. Okay, now, I'll use red. Okay, so if you think about what it costs Frank to make 1 ounce of meat, all right, it's actually 4 ounces of potatoes, right? If you think about it, what it costs Rose, right, to produce 1 ounce of meat, it's 2 ounces of potatoes, okay? All right, now, think about how you get there, right? It's pretty easy, all right? You go back to your table, right? It's actually pretty easy to do. So if you look at your amount produced in 8 hours, is probably the easiest way to do it, right? Or that really doesn't matter, okay? But essentially, this is 32 over 8, right? Which is 4. This is 48 over 24, which would be 2. Okay, so it's pretty easy, but you could also do 20 over 10, etc. You get to the same place. 60 over 15, you get to the same place. Okay, now again, to produce 1 ounce of meat, it costs Frank 4 ounces of potatoes. That's what he could do. It's pretty expensive for him. And for Rose, it's 2 ounces of potatoes. Okay, let's use a different color yet here. All right, and let's look. What does it cost Frank to produce 1 ounce of potatoes, right? It's actually 1/4 ounce of meat, right? And what about Rose? All right. 1/2 ounce of meat. Okay, now, And basically, you're just going the other direction, right? So if you look at your table, it's 15 divided by 60, or 8 divided by 32. Here would be 10 divided by 20, or 24 divided by 8. Really doesn't matter. All right. Okay. Now, here's what you need to see. Now, we've already agreed, by far, Rose is much better at doing both of these things. Okay. But in determining who should do what, okay, you look at the opportunity costs, right? And when it comes to, right, growing potatoes, even though Rose is more efficient at it, right, her opportunity costs are actually greater than the opportunity cost for Frank. So right off the bat, so again, when you're working on that problem and you put together your opportunity cost table, right, which is basically what this is, well, you're thinking, oh my gosh, right, I know that I'm going to ask Frank to grow potatoes and probably just tell Frank, just do that, all right? So again, pretty clear. And then over here, right, the opportunity cost of 1 ounce of meat is only 2 ounces of potatoes. So you're going to tell Rose that she's going to at least concentrate on that, and there may be a split with somebody like Rose where she's going to have to do a little bit. But you'll be able to play around with it and find kind of the magic spot for the two parties. But anyway, so there are lots of countries around the world, the United States being one of them, where we are just so darn efficient at doing a lot of things. All right, that we have absolute advantages in lots of goods, both manufactured as well as agricultural. But we still decide to trade, right, so we can get past that blue line, right? I've kind of erased it, all right, but we can get past that blue line so we can actually increase our ability to consume. Now, with that said, right, the ability to consume more also assumes, right, that consumers get additional consumer surplus, right? That we're actually dropping prices, and we'll do this through another graph. We won't do it right now, but, right, that those imported goods, so when we trade, are actually cheaper, right, than what we would have to charge for goods made here. Now that gets you into kind of some of the policy struggles and some of the political debates we've had back and forth, but nonetheless, that's kind of where we are right now in the United States. I think we're having some very significant arguments. Now, by the way, I think that's all a very healthy debate. I think having these kinds of issues debated in regard to free trade and protectionism and tariffs versus other ways of managing trade, I think they're incredibly healthy to have these kinds of discussions. Okay, so let's look at this idea of comparative advantage, right? Now, so you've got, and we go back to our table here, all right? We have to identify 1 and 1, all right? So in other words, right, no two firms or countries, right? No two countries, no two firms have the exact same cost structure for inputs. No two countries, no two firms, right? And for the most part, we really kind of focus on countries, okay? Now, it is impossible in our situation here for one party to have a comparative advantage in both. Possible to have an absolute advantage in both, but not possible to have a comparative advantage in both. Okay, so we look at this table here and we see, let me use even a different color marker here. All right, if we're looking for comparative advantage, all right, we know Rose has a comparative advantage in regard to meat, and Frank has a comparative advantage in potatoes. So when you're working through the problem, the first thing you're going to think is, okay, now wait a minute. I'm going to have somebody like Frank or whoever's the party over here focus, concentrate, spend more effort on, etc., right, potatoes, and I'm going to have Rose spend more of her time on meat, maybe, and having her do only meat or a lot more meat and kind of concentrate on that. Okay, now, what you saw, however, and what I really want you to make sure you get in your notes, although I want you to know all this stuff, of course, right, is that because of comparative advantage, all right, two parties, right, one and one. One has a comparative advantage and one is the other. One party can't have a comparative advantage in both. All right, that's not possible. But through trade, both parties can be made better off. All right, so again, when we traded, right, both of our points, number 3, if you will, on our two graphs got us past that blue line, got us past that barrier. All right, so both parties were able to benefit. All right, and again, we are making admittedly a qualitative assumption, quantitative maybe too, but a qualitative assumption that being able to consume more is a good thing. Now again, we're throwing conservation and the environment out the window, at least for a little bit, but nonetheless, at least on the surface, but nonetheless, you can see where both countries can be better off. And again, the one real strong take-home message that I would make here is that you think about a country that's on that blue line but needs to find a way to get beyond it to take care of its people. The best way to do it is really through trade. Now again, technological advantages might be able to move that blue curve over time, but the best quick way is really to engage in trade. Okay, so what we're going to do is we'll end there, all right, and I think that's probably quite a bit for now, and we'll pick up with the price of trade when we come back on Wednesday. See you then.